The most dangerous moment in any financial bubble isn't when prices are rising. It's when everyone believes they can still sell for more. People stop asking what something is actually worth. They only care about what the next person will pay. And for a while, that game can make ordinary people feel incredibly rich. Until suddenly, there is no one left to buy. And this isn't just a pattern we see in modern financial markets. Centuries ago, the same psychology created one of the strangest speculative bubbles in history. And it began with a flower. In 1637, a single tulip bulb was supposedly worth as much as a luxury house in Amsterdam. People were buying flowers for fortunes. Then, almost overnight, the market collapsed, prices crashed. Buyers disappeared. Contracts became worthless. For centuries, this story has been told as one of history's greatest financial disasters. A nation supposedly lost its mind. A fortune could disappear in a single afternoon, and the tulip became the ultimate symbol of human greed. But there's a problem with this story. Much of it isn't true. The Dutch economy didn't collapse. The country didn't fall into financial ruin, and the famous Tulip Mania may have been far smaller than the legend suggests. So what actually happened in 1637? And how did a relatively small market failure become one of the most famous economic disasters in history? To understand how a flower could become the center of a financial frenzy, we need to go back to the Netherlands in the 1630s. This was the Dutch Golden Age. Amsterdam was booming. Ships were arriving from across the world. Merchants were making fortunes. And Dutch traders were building one of the most powerful commercial networks on Earth. The Dutch East India Company had become a global giant. Banks made trade easier. Merchants had access to new financial markets, and wealth was spreading through Dutch society. For the first time, ordinary successful merchants could afford things that had once belonged only to aristocrats. And with that new wealth came something else. A desire to show it: beautiful paintings, expensive homes, fine clothing, rare objects from distant lands. And then, from the Ottoman world, something arrived that was almost impossibly exotic to the Dutch eye: a flower. The tulip, at first, nobody imagined it would become a financial obsession. But that was about to change. Tulips weren't native to the Netherlands. They came from the Ottoman world and reached Europe in the 16th century. In Leiden, botanist Carolus Clusius began growing them in his garden. Clusius wasn't trying to make a fortune. To him, tulips were scientific curiosities, exotic plants that few Europeans had ever seen. He was also notoriously unwilling to sell his bulbs. Then, according to the famous story, someone broke into his garden and stole them. And suddenly, the tulip began spreading, but not all tulips were equal. Some produced ordinary flowers. Others developed spectacular patterns. Brilliant streaks of red, purple, or yellow running across pale petals. One variety became especially famous: Semper Augustus. It was extraordinarily beautiful and extraordinarily rare. The rarer the flower became, the more people wanted it. Soon, owning an unusual tulip wasn't just about gardening, it was about status. And that was when something strange began to happen. People weren't simply buying tulips because they wanted to grow them. They were beginning to buy them because they believed someone else would pay even more later. But there was something strange about those spectacular colors. The most beautiful tulips weren't simply rare. Many of them were infected. The brilliant streaks running through their petals were caused by a virus we now know as tulip-breaking virus. It was spread by aphids feeding on infected plants. The virus disrupted the tulip's normal pigmentation, creating those dramatic flames of color that collectors found irresistible. At the time, nobody knew this. To Dutch buyers, these strange patterns looked like nature had created something almost magical. But the virus came with a hidden cost. It weakened the plant. And infected tulips often struggled to produce healthy new bulbs. That meant the most spectacular varieties could be incredibly difficult to reproduce. So the flowers became rare. And rarity pushed prices higher, then higher again. And soon, people weren't just paying for a beautiful flower, they were paying for something they believed might become even more valuable tomorrow. And that's when the tulip market began to change. It was no longer just about flowers. It was becoming a bet. Then winter arrived, and suddenly, the tulips everyone was trading were nowhere to be seen. Tulips bloom for only a few weeks each spring. Their bulbs spend the rest of the year hidden underground. By the winter of 1636, the ground was frozen. The flowers couldn't be dug up, they couldn't be inspected, and they certainly couldn't be delivered, but people still wanted to trade them. So the traders found a solution. They stopped trading the bulbs themselves. Instead, they traded promises. A buyer would agree to pay for a particular bulb in the future when it could finally be dug up. The seller received a promise to deliver it. The buyer received a promise to pay. No flower had to change hands. Sometimes, the only thing being traded was a piece of paper, and that changed everything, because now people could make deals worth enormous amounts of money without actually possessing the tulip. The market had become a game of expectations. Buy today, sell tomorrow, and hope the next person would pay even more. These trades didn't happen inside grand financial institutions. They happened in taverns. Across the Netherlands, groups of traders gathered in back rooms, drinking, talking, and making deals over tulip bulbs that were still buried underground. The market was informal. There were no giant trading screens. No computers. Sometimes there wasn't even a flower in the room, just a contract and a promise. Buyers often didn't pay the full price up front. Instead, a small payment, sometimes called wine money, was enough to seal the agreement. Then the contract could change hands again. And again, the price kept rising. One person bought a bulb for a certain amount, expecting to sell the contract to someone else for more. That person did the same thing. The actual tulip barely mattered anymore. The expectation of a higher price was becoming the product. And by the beginning of 1637, that expectation had reached its breaking point. Because eventually, someone has to ask the most dangerous question in any speculative market. What happens when there are no more buyers? By the winter of 1636, the trading frenzy was accelerating. Prices were climbing at astonishing speed. A tulip contract could change hands several times before the bulb was even dug out of the ground. And every new buyer had the same thought. Someone else will pay more. One famous record describes what was supposedly offered for a single viceroy tulip: 2 loads of wheat, 4 loads of rye, 4 oxen, 8 pigs, 12 sheep, barrels of wine and beer, 2 tons of butter, a bed, a suit of clothes, and a silver drinking cup. The total was worth thousands of guilders, and at the very peak of the market, some contracts for exceptionally rare tulips were valued at more than 5,000 guilders. For comparison, a skilled craftsman might earn only a few hundred guilders in an entire year. The numbers seemed absurd. But as long as prices kept rising, nobody cared. Then came February 1637, and everything changed. One auction was about to reveal just how fragile the entire market really was. On February 3rd, 1637, traders gathered in Haarlem for another tulip auction. Everyone expected the usual scene. A seller would name a price. A buyer would make an offer. Then another buyer would offer more. But this time, something was different. The auctioneer announced the first price: silence. Nobody bid. He lowered the price, still nothing. He lowered it again, no one moved. The room had suddenly gone cold. The problem wasn't that the tulips had disappeared. The problem was that buyers had disappeared. Word spread quickly from one trading group to another. If nobody was willing to buy at the old prices, then yesterday's fortune suddenly meant very little. The same contracts that had seemed incredibly valuable only days earlier were now becoming impossible to sell. Panic began spreading through the market. People who had promised to pay thousands of guilders started backing away. and sellers were left holding contracts that nobody wanted. The great tulip boom had reached its turning point. But this is where the story becomes much more complicated than the legend suggests. Within days, the news had spread. Traders who had promised enormous sums for tulip contracts were suddenly refusing to complete their purchases. Sellers were trapped. They had agreements on paper, but finding someone willing to pay the new prices was becoming almost impossible. The market had stopped moving, and once people realized that, fear took over. Rumors began spreading through Dutch towns. Some claimed that fortunes had vanished overnight. Others said traders were facing ruin. Later stories even claimed that desperate investors were throwing themselves into Amsterdam's canals. It made for a spectacular story, a nation obsessed with flowers, fortunes destroyed, people driven to despair, a financial catastrophe unfolding before everyone's eyes. For centuries, that became the accepted version of Tulip Mania. But there was one problem. The evidence didn't match the story, and eventually historians went back to the original records to find out what had really happened. For centuries, the story seemed settled. Tulip Mania had been a national disaster. But historians eventually started asking a simple question: where is the evidence? One of the most important investigations came from historian Anne Goldgar. She went back to the surviving records from the Netherlands, not legends, not later books, the actual documents, court records, notary documents, tax records, business agreements, thousands of pieces of evidence from the period surrounding the crash. And what she found was surprising. There was no clear sign of a nationwide economic collapse. No evidence that the Dutch economy had been destroyed, and nowhere near the number of ruined families that the famous stories would lead you to expect. Tulip traders certainly lost money. Some contracts were abandoned. Some people were caught in the collapse, but the disaster was far more limited than the legend suggested. The Dutch Golden Age didn't suddenly end in 1637. Amsterdam kept trading, ships kept sailing, merchants kept making money, and the Dutch economy continued to grow. So if Tulip Mania didn't destroy the Netherlands, why did we spend hundreds of years believing that it did? So how could a market filled with contracts worth thousands of guilders collapse without bringing the Dutch economy down with it? The answer was surprisingly simple. Most of the money had never actually been paid. These were promises to buy tulip bulbs in the future. When the market collapsed, many buyers simply refused to complete the deals. The Dutch authorities eventually stepped in. Instead of forcing every contract to be fulfilled at the original price, buyers were allowed to cancel their agreements by paying a relatively small penalty. And just like that, enormous amounts of supposed wealth disappeared, not because millions of guilders had vanished from Dutch banks, but because much of that wealth had never existed as cash in the first place. It existed only on paper. A price had been agreed. A promise had been made, then the promise was broken, and the number simply disappeared. The great fortune that everyone thought existed was, in large part, a mountain of promises built on top of other promises, but there was still one mystery left. If the crash itself was relatively contained, where did the legend of the great Dutch financial disaster come from? So, if the Dutch economy didn't collapse, where did the story come from? Part of the answer lies in the years immediately after the market froze. Writers began publishing stories about greedy tulip traders who had supposedly lost everything. They were portrayed as fools. Some illustrations showed traders as monkeys dressed in expensive clothing, gambling away their fortunes. The message was clear: greed had gone too far. These stories weren't written as neutral financial reports. They were moral warnings. The tulip traders were being held up as examples of what happened when people became obsessed with wealth. And the stories were powerful. They were dramatic. They were easy to remember. And most importantly, they made a perfect cautionary tale. Then, 2 centuries later, another writer helped carry that tale far beyond the Netherlands. His name was Charles Mackay. In 1841, Mackay published Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. His book became enormously influential. And his account of Tulip Mania helped turn an exaggerated 17th century story into the version of history that millions of people would eventually learn. A story about a nation that supposedly went insane over flowers. A story about fortunes destroyed overnight. A story that sounded almost too perfect to question, but there was one final irony. The tulip itself had never been as powerful as the story surrounding it. And the rarest flower at the center of the legend would eventually disappear completely. And there is one final twist to the story. The most famous tulip of all may have been doomed from the beginning. Semper Augustus was prized for its extraordinary red and white patterns. But those patterns were linked to the same virus that made the flower so visually spectacular, the infection weakened the plant, it made reproduction difficult. And over time, the strain became increasingly fragile. Eventually, Semper Augustus disappeared. The flower that had once been valued at a fortune was gone. Not because the market destroyed it, not because the Dutch economy collapsed, but because of its own biology. And that leaves us with a very different lesson from the one we were taught. Tulip Mania wasn't completely imaginary. People really did speculate. Prices really did rise dramatically, and the market really did collapse. But the story of a nation destroyed by flowers is largely a myth built over centuries. The real lesson may be even more interesting. A market can create enormous numbers on paper. A rumor can become history. And a dramatic story can survive for centuries, even after the evidence tells us something very different. In 1637, people traded tulip contracts because they believed someone else would pay more. 400 years later, we inherited the story because we believed someone else had already checked the facts. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing being traded isn't money. It's the story itself.